worked 26 years for Duch. He has been a creation speaker for 15 years. He is one of the ICR speakers, and he's going to talk today about Mount St. Helens, explosive evidence for creation.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And this is my third year in a row to be here. And those of you who have attended in the past, and those who haven't, the talks are over here. One on the age of the earth and how to know how old things are. The other one, an overview of all the evidence that really supports a biblical worldview. But tonight I'm going to talk about explosive evidence, geological evidence for creation. Now most people, as they start to think about geology, they start to go asleep. So I refuse to start there, so you'll stay awake at least for the beginning of the talk. Instead, I'm going to start where Josh McDowell is at today. Those of you who are in the Christian community recognize the name. Josh McDowell has been working with teenagers and high school kids and junior high kids and college kids for 4 decades now. Since the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, he's been working to, once he started to study Christianity and realized it was true, he had a passion to share it with others. And last year, in 2006, he came out with his latest book, which was The Last Christian Generation. Because as he has worked with students, he has come to see more and more and more Christianity is becoming totally irrelevant to the culture around us. It is not just the world, the people who aren't in churches, it's the church kids. You see, surveys by Barna and others have shown that 81% of churched youth, these are kids in evangelical churches, and they attend church Bible clubs, and they attend youth groups, and they go to youth camps, and they hear the Sunday sermons, 81% of them, if polled today, in our colleges and high schools and universities, don't believe that absolute truth exists. Now, that's their mindset. But our mindset and what we believe to be true always, always, always affects our actions. You see, in the same poll, they started to ask these teenagers, when was the last time you lied to your parents? When was the last time you cheated on a test? When was the last time you took something, even something very small? And there was no discernible difference between kids in the church and kids in the culture. Well, is that a surprise? They don't believe in absolute truth. They believe they can make up their own version of what's right. And if it's okay and it's not hurting anybody, why shouldn't I do it? Depending on the poll and depending on what you define as someone who believes in Christianity, anywhere from 63 to 95% of these same churched youth walk away from a real Christian faith within their first 4 years of college. They just totally walk away. They don't even bother to go to church anymore. You know, for instance, there was a recent survey last year by Barna. They surveyed 20,000 students from 1,000 Christian schools. A lot of parents think, I got to get my kids out of public education. They're being taught all this stuff that isn't true, exposed to all these bad influences. I'll send them to a Christian school. 20,000 kids in a Christian school were polled, 1,000 different schools. 63% of these students said they didn't believe Jesus is God. 63% of them. 58% believe that all faiths are equally valid ways to get to heaven. 58%. That's the culture we live in. If we don't understand the culture, how are we going to change it? 65% don't believe in Satan, but 68% don't even believe in the Holy Spirit. In Christian schools, that's the culture we are sending our kids out to affect and to grow up in. And the reason is the Bible is no longer considered authoritative. It has been replaced by science as the absolute authority. If you're having a debate, if any of your kids are having a debate with other kids in a Christian school or not, and they say, well, the Bible says, it's going to carry very little weight. But if they say science has proved, it's going to carry a lot of weight. That's why the subjects we're talking about here throughout the different seminars from TCCA, SA, or this lecture are so important. So, to understand how to get back to where we ought to be as a Christian community, I think you really need to understand how we got here as a Christian community. And I'm not going to start yet talking about geology. I'm going to keep you in suspense. Instead, I'm going to go back to the late 1700s, early 1800s, and talk about another young man who was growing up in the culture of his day and trying to resist the influences of his day. See, this young man was a very intelligent young man from the upper classes in Europe, born in the 1700s. Grew up, he showed great promise. And at that time, in that culture, if you showed great promise, you were just assumed you would go on to theological school to be a pastor, because the pastors were the leaders. They were often the most intelligent people in the culture. So he went through seminary, but after a few years in seminary, he decided, well, that really wasn't his cup of tea. He had more of an adventurous spirit. Now, the folks that just longed for adventure in that day, Europe of the day, they didn't have airplanes, they didn't have radio, they didn't have TV, they didn't have video games, but they were becoming more affluent. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. There was more leisure time for the upper class. And what they loved to do was to go into lecture halls like this. This was their entertainment. This wasn't something they gave up TV and video games to come do. This was the thing they did, and the lecturers would come, and they would speak about what they'd learned of the human body. And people who had been out to different areas of the world would come and talk about what they'd learned. Well, that sounded great to this young man. So he signed up for a 5-year voyage on the transportation media of the day. He was going to be a naturalist on an old wooden sailing vessel. So off he went sailing across the world. And remember, he had come from a theological background. So as he got on the book, he naturally took the most respected book of the day with him, the Holy Bible, as one of his things to study and learn from as he left on this voyage. But he also happened to take another set of very popular books. The captain of the ship had loaned them to him, called The Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. Now, these give two very, very different views of reality. Here's Charles Lyell, born in the earlier 1700s. At that time, Charles Hutton had developed this idea that you could explain all of the geology of the earth, all of the layers of rocks, all the fossils, by slow, gradual processes as large periods of time passed and things got trapped and built up these layers of the earth. Sounds familiar to what we're being taught today, doesn't it? Well, that was really developed 200 years ago. And Hutton strongly influenced Lyell, who wrote this theory and did lots of meticulous studies of different areas of geology in this large volume of works called The Principles of Geology, that said there hasn't been major, vast changes on the earth. It's been slow, gradual processes that's built up the geology we see on the earth. Well, what most people don't know, because it's not taught in our schools, is that both Hutton and Lyell, who was a lawyer from London, were what we would call atheists today. They didn't call themselves that then because it wasn't popular to be called an atheist. They called themselves searchers or searching or skeptics, but not atheists. But this is what Charles Lyell had to say about what he was trying to do. He said, he wrote this in a letter to a friend, I conceived the idea of slow, gradual processes, replacing a biblical flood as explainer for geology 5 or 6 years ago. That if I could ever have the Mosaic chronology set down, in other words, what Moses wrote about a worldwide flood, if we could just throw that out without giving offense to the Christian community, it would be in a historical sketch, a book about geology. And if we don't irritate them, now he's talking about the church leaders, which I fear we may, if we try to say Moses wasn't right and you can't trust Genesis, you're liable to irritate the people in charge of the church. But if we can do it in a book of science without irritating the church, then we shall carry all with us. We shall totally overturn the Christian faith. That's what he's saying. If you don't try to triumph over them, in other words, if you don't do a direct attack on Christianity, but if you just undermine the basis of the Bible, and if we compliment the liberality and the candor of the present age, if we tell the church leaders, oh, you're great open-minded people, you love science, you can just look at the different theories and accept them along with the Bible, then the bishops and the enlightened saints will join us in despising both the ancient and modern physiotheologians. In other words, the people who believe the Bible talks literally about the physical world. We can overturn all that if we can just undermine it with a different way of understanding the geology of the world. That was his goal, to undermine the Bible. You see, and that's what's been going on. And as I talk about geology, I want you to think very carefully about what the actual facts and the evidence show us. By throwing out the idea of a worldwide flood and what it would have done for geology, what you're essentially doing is expanding the time frame of Genesis. You're throwing huge periods of time in there that will, in people's minds, make anything seem possible. But what you're really doing is totally destroying people's trust in God's Word. Right back to that first slide. Okay, back to our story. Here comes this young man. He's traveling across the Atlantic. One of the first stops they make is down at the bottom of South America in Argentina, a place called the Santa Cruz River Valley. And this is out of the biography of this explorer. It says, the explorer was very curious about the geology of the river valley. The walls of the valley had the same layers and shells he'd seen many times. And it was during this expedition that he theorized that the cliffs of the river valley, and indeed the entire Andes Mountains, had been slowly, over huge periods of time, raised above sea level. You can't trust what the Bible says about where things came from. This was man's theory, and that must be true, because look at the shells. Those tall mountains had to have been under the water, and it had to have taken huge periods of time. See, here he stood looking at this river valley, and I can understand. That must have taken enormous periods of time for that to form. Look at that little tiny river down here, this just little river down here at the bottom of the valley, and forms a lake, and just it carved over eons of time, carved out that enormous chasm in the earth. Well, the young explorer looked at the Bible and what it had to say. God created the heavens and the earth in 6 literal days. He looked at these geological formations and what Charles Lyell had to say, huge periods of time, and he decided philosophically to throw out God's Word and accept man's theories as he looked at the geological world around him. From there, he went around the South America and ended up at the Galapagos Islands, where he looked at finches, amongst other things. And he saw finches on the mainland that had one kind of beak, and finches on the Galapagos Island that had other kinds of beaks, and the ones on the island seemed to be more fit for the type of seeds they were finding on the island. And he thought, you know what? Just like in geology, if there were huge periods of time and small little changes and variations that were more favorable for survival, then that one kind of bird on the land could turn into the kind of bird on the island. As a matter of fact, if you had even more time, that bird could probably turn into some other kind of creature, and that creature could turn into another kind of creature. And of course, by now you know who I'm talking about. It was Charles Darwin. You see, Charles Darwin didn't just out of the blue come up with this idea of evolution. He built upon the ideas from geology. But the irony of it all is that he was totally wrong about the Santa Cruz River Valley. You see, geologists today now know that river valley was carved out by glaciers, huge glaciers that moved in through the area and carved out the gorge over a period of thousands, or at most hundreds, or at most thousands of years, not over a period of millions of years. So the very thing that had most impressed him to develop the theory of biological evolution was based on totally erroneous assumptions of the world around him and the geological world. Well, he went on to write The Origin of the Species. This is the more modern version of The Origin that was just published a few years ago. And in the introduction in the flyleaf says this. These theories, it's saying it goes through and it says there were lots of ideas about evolution before Darwin, and lots of people had this idea that life could have developed from other forms of life. But they say these theories preceding Darwin were discarded because the Earth was thought to be so new, only 6,000 years old. You see, Darwin's theory wasn't accepted until the geology of the Earth had been misinterpreted, and then his theory of biological evolution found a foothold in the intellectual community of Europe, and the rest is history. And by the way, just an aside, which a whole lecture could be spent on, you never see the title, the full title of Darwin's book. It was Origin of the Species by Natural Selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. See, Darwin is a very strong racist who believed one race was better than another race because it was more evolved, that led to all the excesses of the Industrial Revolution and Nazism and communism and Marx and Hitler. They were all strongly influenced. And eugenics, all of these have their roots in the belief that some species or groups of people are more evolved than others. Well, this is where we're at today. And you all know this. This is what's taught in the schools, in the museums, in the movies, all around us. And the people around us, this is their foundation of reality. That there have been huge periods of time and random processes and explosive forces have created all the stars around us. And that chemicals just came alive, just by miraculous things, just came alive in the right way. And you still see it. You open a newspaper, they speculate there's water on some planet somewhere, immediately followed by a statement, life could develop there. It doesn't develop in our sinks, yet we could develop on Mars. You know, it's not just... You know, and little things like that aren't meant as a put down, but they're meant as examples of waking up your friends and your neighbors and your coworkers as you talk about these subjects, and they do come up in the newspaper. And then 1 billion years ago, life started to develop from single cells to multi-cells to plants to algae to fish to reptiles and amphibians and dinosaurs, and finally people came about 1 million years ago and so on. Well, that's a model. And it is the reference of reality of the world around us. But this is the damage. It's not just that it's another explanation for things. It's a model that says death has always been around. Disease has always been around. Extinctions have always been around. Well, if you want to stick God in there, where do you fit God into it? What it says is, God is the one who made things by way of death and distinctions and disease and one group wiping out another. It's a slam on the character of who God is. And it places the blame for all those things on God. And if those who want to accept an old earth and all these layers and all these fossils down in the earth layers, they still have to say, well, God must have just made it that way. All those things that are laid down in those fossil layers are because God made it that way. That's not what the Bible says. It's a total distortion of biblical truth, which talks absolutely crystal clear about a creation of separate types of plants and animals. 10 times it says God created trees to reproduce after their own kind, birds to reproduce after their own kind, fish to reproduce after their own kind, creeping things to 10 times. It gets monotonous because God knew it was important and he wanted to get it crystal clear. And that is the framework of biology. And if we don't use that as the framework of biology, who's going to teach our kids about biology? The world that's going to basically say you can't trust God's word. And then where did death come from? It was because Adam and Eve were real. They really were two real people. And they really did choose to rebel against God. So you don't hear it in schools. And nobody's going to hear it if we don't talk about it. And you don't even hear it very often in churches. But that's why there is death. Because if God hadn't instituted death, they would have continued as perfect biological creatures to reproduce cells without mistakes, and they would have continued to live forever in separation, in spiritual separation from their Maker. So God brought about death so that he could subsequently bring Christ as a solution to death so that we wouldn't live forever in separation. See, that's where death fits in. People don't even realize it because they don't hear this framework. And there really was a worldwide flood. And that's where we're heading with this lecture. So here's two models. And I'm a scientist, and I work as a research leader, and I develop new products, and I observe the world in order to understand it and be able to control and use it. That's one of the first biblical mandates of God. Have dominion over the earth. Study and understand it. The evolution model, which says life developed over huge periods of time and diversified and turned into lots of creatures. And the creation model that says there were these distinct God interacting with his creation periods of history. Which one is true? Well, science can tell us which one is true. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to throw out a couple misconceptions. Most people believe fossils prove evolution. This is the Fossil National Monument full of dinosaur bones. What's never taught? There are more clamshells in that formation by orders of magnitude than there are dinosaur bones. Does that mean all these dinosaurs, land-dwelling dinosaurs, were swimming around in the ocean when they died? No, it's just a flood deposit of different types of sediment. Clams with dinosaurs. But the bias, that's the data. Those bones don't talk. They don't come with a label. They don't tell us how they were buried. They don't tell us how they got so deep. They don't tell us how old they are. They're just bones stuck in rock. And the bias of the researcher can totally blind the person who's studying them to what is the truth. You see, if you assume evolution is true, and let's be honest now, if evolution didn't happen, there are only two possibilities. Either one moment in history, one moment in time, there wasn't anything sitting there on Earth, and the next moment there was a dog sitting there, and there was a cat, and there was a dinosaur, and there was a man, and there was a fruit tree. And the instant before that, there was nothing. That's one possibility. Or something else turned into all those things. If you boil down all the different theories and all the different possibilities, those are the only two possibilities. Either one moment there was something there, and the next moment there wasn't, or something turned into us. And we're just part of the biological world. We also have spirits and souls. But if you don't assume things suddenly appeared, which is out of bounds by the current definition of science, it's just defined that you can't consider that possibility, then some sort of evolution must have happened. And if you assume evolution happened and you look at the rocks and the fossils, then you kind of come away with a certain set of assumptions. And I'm going to give you two classic examples of this. The first is Piltdown Man. They found an ape-like skull in Piltdown, England in 1912, and it had a very human-like jaw and teeth. So you got an ape skull with human teeth. It's a link between the two. It's a classic, perfect, exactly what they've been looking for 60 years since Darwin came out with the theory of evolution. And for the next 40 years, I'm sorry, I said 30, that should be 40, till 1952, over 300 papers were written on this. And the skull was in the London Museum of Natural History, and it was taught in the textbooks, and it was discussed in anthropology classes. This is a classic painting of Darwin in the background, looking at the anthropologists of the day as they examined Piltdown Man. And any Christian who dared to say, I believe man was created, would be made to look a fool in these classrooms, because there was the physical evidence. Except it was a total hoax. In 1952, they dated the jaw and the skull with a new dating method and found out they were totally different. They obviously had to have come from different creatures. Someone had planted them there as a hoax. But this is what gets me. It was then noted that there were file marks on the teeth. 300 papers written, all accepting this as a link between man and ape by learned PhD scientists. It had file marks on the teeth. And they all missed it. You see, if you accept that something is true, and that's your paradigm, that's your frame of reference of truth, you miss the absolute obvious. That's the danger of our education system. The second example, this is, Don Slinger gave me this picture. He was recently down at the North Carolina Museum of Natural History, and they had a cast, or a replication of a Tyrannosaurus rex dinosaur bone. It's a 3.5 foot tall bone that was found in North Dakota by Mary Schweitzer. She's a PhD paleontologist. And it's assumed that it's 68 million years old. But as they were lifting it out, they had to break it open. And she took the time for the first time ever to look closely inside of it to see what she could find about the structure of this bone. This is right out of that display. What she found was blood vessels, blood cells, and soft tissue. After 65 million years, it hadn't degraded? Now, I'm going to show a 2-minute clip of an interview of Dr. Schweitzer as people interview her about this find, because it's just so revealing how blind she and the scientific community can be about what they found and how maybe their paradigm is totally wrong.
That dinosaur discovery, the scientific world is still reeling from the discovery of actual Tyrannosaurus rex cells and soft tissue unearthed last week at a Montana excavation site.
North Carolina State University professor Mary Schweitzer is the leader of the discovery team that found these extraordinary specimens.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us, how significant a discovery is this?
Well, it has the potential to be very significant, but for right now, until we do further analyses, I think all we can say is it's really cool.
Well, Professor, as I understand it, this was sort of an accidental discovery. You had to split one of the bones in half because it was simply too big to get into a helicopter, and in splitting the bone, you suddenly realized you had this soft tissue on your hands. Is that correct?
Well, it wasn't quite that sudden. They had to split the bone in the field, as was reported, and when it got back to the lab and Carrie Ansell began preparing it, she reserved some of the fragments for chemical analyses, and so it was treated slightly different than most dinosaur bone is in the field.
Is that amazing to find this kind of soft tissue in a fossil this old? And what can the soft tissue really tell us?
Well, it's very amazing. It's utterly shocking, actually, because it flies in the face of everything that we understand about how tissues and cells degrade. It's not something that any one of us could ever predict or hope for. And I think that it's important to remember that we don't know for sure what it still is. It looks like blood vessels, and it looks like bone matrix, and it certainly looks like cells, and it acts like cells. But we haven't done the chemical analysis that let us say what it is for sure.
Professor, a word comes to us that the capillary structure or something that you've observed is actually very similar to that of an ostrich, and I'm wondering, does this add fuel to the idea that the dinosaurs and birds were in fact related?
Well, potentially yes. Realize that the blood vessels in your bone look just exactly the same as well. Vessels at the level that we reported in the paper all kind of look the same. It's the molecular constituents that differ from one animal to another, or from animals to humans. So
yeah, we'll jump ahead.
And one of the exciting things about this discovery, correct me if I'm wrong, is the fact that this stuff was fossilized as it was. At 70 million years old, you don't expect to find soft tissue, do you?
Not at all. No. It was utterly shocking.
So you have to sort of rewrite the book as far as fossilization goes, I assume.
Well, that's the exciting part for me. I've always been very intrigued by how things change in going from a living being to part of the rock record. And like I said, a lot of our science doesn't allow for this. All of the chemistry and all of the molecular breakdown experiments that we've done don't allow for this. So if this material turns out to be actual remnants of the dinosaur, then yes, I think we will have to do some certainly rethinking of some of the basics of the model of fossilization.
You know,
Well,
Mary, when I was reading about this story, I was amazed that in some of the capillaries, when you went to pull them, they snapped right back. Are you amazed at the quality of these remains?
Absolutely.
70 million years old, huh?
It's just doesn't seem possible. But yes, you can actually take the vessels, and they do have internal components, and so you can take a probe and kind of squeeze those things out into solution, and the vessels are fine. It's just, I can't explain it, to be honest.
Very cool.
Well, Professor Mary Schweitzer, congratulations, and thank you very much for stopping by.
Thank you so much.
Do you see the blindness? It's like it goes against everything they know, and they've done everything they can possibly do to try to say it isn't the dinosaur. It looks like a cell, it smells like a cell, it tastes like a cell, it acts like a cell, and every analysis I've heard since then, this is less than a year old, has shown that is a dinosaur parts. Now, in a few thousand years, the flood would have been about 4,500 years ago. That's not at all unreasonable. We still have garbage dumps from the ancient Egyptians that stuff hasn't totally degraded. But 65 million years without, it goes against everything we know about biological matter. But they're not willing to touch the time frame, because without those huge periods of time, all you're stuck with is God's interaction and the truth of the Bible. Here's a slide of just what they found inside of this dinosaur bone, and they found many others since. Oops, what happened? This is just what you would see. The stretchy tissue, the blood cells, inside of capillaries, obviously inside of a bone, inside of a dinosaur bone, and still sketchy. So the point is, if you assume evolution, you're going to ignore part of the data or the assumptions of that data. I believe, and what I'm going to show you as we hit Mount St. Helens, is that by assuming the Bible means what it says and it's true history, you can look at all the data and it fits much, much better. You see, evolution became very popular as it looked at these small changes from simple life to sea life to fish to plant life to amphibians to dinosaurs to mammals and finally to people. You see this classic chart everywhere, and you tend to find sea life simple life coral shells lower in the rock layers. Therefore, this type of chart became very popular in schools. But there's another explanation for the same data. You see, during a worldwide water catastrophe, it's quite likely the huge mountains, the Himalayas, the Rockies, would have been pushed up as India slammed into Europe, and there were enormous continental plate movements at the end of the flood as the continents rose up and the mountains settled down. So the mountains appeared later. The low rolling hills before the flood would have been covered by water, and as the flood waters rose, what would have been buried first is massive sediments swept off the land. The low-lying ocean creatures, the clams, the shells, the corals. And then later more mobile fish would have been buried, or animals who lived along the seashore and in swampy areas would have been tended to have been buried in groupings together. And finally, mammals or more mobile mammals would have been buried last. This is the picture you get. Same rocks, same fossils, same data, different explanation. The lowest stuff isn't millions and billions of years older. It's merely things that were buried first during this worldwide flood. And the Bible, absolutely crystal clear, God didn't want us to mess it up, talks about a worldwide flood. If you go through Genesis, any Hebrew scholar, you go to the major Hebrew scholars of Israel or the various areas of the earth, and you say, what was the biblical story of Genesis chapters 5 up through chapters 9 trying to tell us? All of them will exclusively say it is meant to say that all of the earth was flooded by water. That all the mountains were covered under the heavens, it says. All creatures died, all mankind, everything. A worldwide flood, not some little local disaster. And then in Job it refers to wicked men being washed away. In Hebrews it talks about the rest of the world perished while Noah prepared an ark. And in Peter, I'm going to get to this at the very end, there's a verse that talks about the whole world was deluged at that time. And Jesus himself said the world was just ignoring God and going about normal life until the flood came and took them all away. And every one of those words indicates universal, worldwide destruction, not some local little destruction. The Bible's crystal clear. But it's not just the Bible. Every culture in the world, major cultures, as missionaries went out 200-300 years ago and collected their stories about what they believed to be true so they could reach them, they all had a story of a flood. This astounded the missionaries. Well, at that time, it probably didn't because they knew it was true. But the Alaska Eskimos didn't have a story of God freezing the world out. They had a story of a flood. The Armenians, where they have earthquakes every 10 years, didn't have a story about an earthquake coming and shaking the earth for bringing judgment. It was a story of a flood. The desert regions didn't have a story about God droughting out the world. It was always a story of a flood because it's a real event. It's become distorted, but mankind has passed it on generation after generation. Now, one more example. I want to talk about the flood, and then I'll get to Mount St. Helens. Steve Austin works for the Institute for Creation Research. And back about 6 years ago, he prayed that he could have an original scientific discovery that the geological community did not know about. Now, he'd been in the Grand Canyon dozens of times leading tours and talked to other geologists. And one of the things they said was that there are these gaps between rocks where supposedly you have a rock layer laying right on top of another rock layer, and there's just like a missing 200 million years there. No evidence of it. It's just been wiped away, and one rock layer sits on top of another. They call it a discontinuity. And they said, yeah, there's discontinuities in the Grand Canyon, but the red wall limestone is absolute proof that millions of years have passed, because there's 400 foot of limestone sitting there in a Grand Canyon. This is a picture of the red wall limestone, and it covers Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, several 100,000 miles, 200 to 400 foot thick layer of sediment, all limestone, that the people who believe in an old earth would say that had to have been an ancient ocean that was there for millions of years as all these sea creatures slowly settled and their bodies got compacted together, and it formed this layer of lime that turned to stone. And that's where that red wall limestone came from in the Grand Canyon. Well, Steve started studying it a little closer, and he noted in the Grand Canyon literature that nautiloids, which are just cone-shaped, like ice cream cone-shaped shells. Like this is a fossil of a nautiloid. Was said to be one of the rarest fossils in the Grand Canyon, but he'd seen dozens of them. Well, that perked his interest. So he started to do a survey and look in other areas, and he went outside the Grand Canyon and up and down the canyons, and he discovered that these nautiloids were always in this 200 to 400 foot thick layer of sandstone, or limestone. They were always in a 2 or 3 foot band near the middle of that layer. And as he went over that whole 100,000 square foot area, over to Las Vegas and up into Utah and into Wyoming, well, not Wyoming, but Colorado, he always found these nautiloids, and he mapped them, and he noticed they were statistically oriented in a non-random direction, like a flow direction. And then he started to do the research, and he found that if you flow a highly, like mud, highly sediment-layered fluid at high velocity, and then you throw large objects in it, those large objects will orient themselves near the center, near a turbulent to laminar flow layer. They'll just orient themselves right in the center of that flow layer. So that entire deposit has been shown by this evidence to have been caused by a catastrophic flood flow event. And it's phenomenal. It's the largest. There's over 1 billion nautiloid shells, all oriented, and the believers, those evolution geologists, had never even thought to look for them because they're so blinded that it was just a slow, gradual sediment layer that formed. You see, these are the creatures, they're now extinct, that lived at that time. You find them in the fossil record, and he found a bunch. But the fact of the Noah's flood, the reality of the Noah's flood, is really the bottom line issue for the whole creation, evolution, age of the earth, can you trust the Bible or not debate. Because if there was a flood, that's what have made all the rock layers and all the sediment and all the salt beds, and it would have caused a subsequent ice age and had all these consequences. But the evolutionists would say, yeah, you can interpret it that way if you want, but how are you going to show that? There's no huge geological flood event that shows what a flood would even do. And they said this for years until 1980 when Mount St. Helens blew up. And that's the significance of this event. This is Mount St. Helens. It is one of the mountains along a ridge of mountains in the Pacific Northwest. You got Mount Rainier and Mount Adams and Mount Hood, and Mount St. Helens was just one of those volcanoes that popped up out of a geological active area. You know, over in here is Yellowstone National Park, and there's lots of geological activity. The mountains weren't active for decades or centuries, but Mount St. Helens became active in 1979. In October of 1979, it first started to show signs of activities. There'd be these little puffs of steam that would come up out of the top of the mountain. And it would drop some ash on top of the mountain. That would just darken the top of the mountain. And then a few weeks would go by, or a few months, and there'd be another puff of steam, and a little bit of ash would come out. Here's another small puff in January. Well, it became more and more active, and volcanists, those aren't the pointy-eared people from Vulcan. These are people who study volcanoes. They get excited when volcanoes start to get active because, man, that's what they went to college to do. And they moved in droves, and they put their pins all around the mountain, and they aimed lasers at it, and they're watching how fast it's growing and setting up survey peaks and everything. And they're saying, man, blow, baby, blow. But nothing much is happening. And the governor has moved all the people out. I mean, all the way back in November. And this is a resort and vacation homes, and money's being lost. And it goes on up through March and February, and you get a few little puffs, but nothing else seems to be happening. And as I am told, the governor had planned to pull the prohibition and allow people to move back in early in May. Well, it got up to the morning of May 18th. I want to get the date right. It was a Sunday morning. Sun's coming up. This is one of the planes that was flying by taking pictures. It took a picture of the top of the mountain. It does a few more laps, and as it's taking pictures and looking back at 8:30 in the morning, this is the picture it took as it flew past the mountain. The geologists got their wish. The mountain blew. But it wasn't a normal way a volcano just shoots out the top. In this case, the mountain kind of sheared off, and all of the hot gas and the steam and the enormous amounts of energy that came out of this mountain pulverized the side of the mountain. The mountain used to come up like this and come back down. it basically turned into a fluid flow event that flowed down the side of the mountain. This is a picture of what used to be the top of the mountain flowing like a very energetic, high sediment-laden mud layer flowing down into the valley below as the steam is starting to come out of the mountain. Now, this picture was taken by a geologist who was stationed about 6 miles away on the third ridge away from the mountain. Here's the first ridge a couple miles and the second ridge, and he's on the third ridge taking these pictures. Here's a schematic, the debris blow heading down the mountain, the steam and gas shooting horizontally out of the mountain, more hot ash and steam coming straight out of the mountain, and then the magma lava starting to come out, and the debris coming down. And then the debris, within a matter of tenths of seconds, has moved on down into the valley. Here's a picture of the mountain in full eruption. Once again, he's taking these pictures as fast as he can. See these streaks? At the end of these streaks are blocks of stone as large as this building, some of which were found 5 to 10 miles away. They were thrown that far, just like a little kid would throw a pebble. So here's our geologist taking pictures and having a good time enjoying the view as the mountain is erupting. That's what he came for. All right. But you'll note it's sort of heading in his direction. This is the next picture he takes. Now, this is out of a magazine. That's why there's a scene. But he's taking pretty much as fast as he can take this picture. This is estimated at 600 degrees Fahrenheit. It's now about 2 miles away from him and approaching fast. This is the next picture he takes, at which point he decided he had enough pictures. You can actually, you can see the leaves starting to wilt on this. He took this picture over his shoulder as he's running toward his truck, jumped in his truck. Miraculously, the hot air was deflected upward as he was driving down the mountain road downward, and he survived to take this picture out of his window, and it was deflected upward, and he survived and got away. Many others didn't. Here's the mountain in full eruption. The same amount of energy every second as one of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima. Every second. Like another bomb, another bomb, another bomb, and it erupted for over 24 hours. Continuously with that amount of energy coming out. It sent ash 15 miles into the air, affected, completely cloud-covered 250 miles away in Spokane, Washington, as it continued to erupt and erupt and erupt and spew out enormous amounts of ash. This is a radar or a satellite picture. The mountain's erupting right here. Ash cloud. That's all ash being spewed out over a large part of the western United States. There's, once again, mountain in full eruption. Now, I've got a bunch of things we've learned from this. The first thing I like to note, the total eruption for the entire period of time, the number of days that Mount St. Helens erupted, it put out an estimated 1 cubic kilometer of ejected ash. If you piled together all the ash, it would be a cubic kilometer. Well, back in 1912, there was another volcano that put out 12 cubic kilometers. In 1883, Krakatoa in the South Pacific erupted, put out 18 cubic kilometers of ash. That one volcano caused what's called the mini ice age in Europe. For an entire summer, the temperatures in Europe never got above wintertime temperatures in Europe because of one volcano. Now keep this in mind as we start thinking about what would have been going on during Noah's flood. It would have totally resurfaced this planet. It would have totally changed the climate and the atmosphere. We've got all these schools throughout this country talking about the global warming crisis. It's nothing. It's a drop in the ocean compared to the climate things that were going on only 4,500 years ago during Noah's flood, with reverberations that lasted for hundreds of years afterwards, and we're still settling down from it. Here's Mount St. Helens before the eruption, same view, same angle, total devastation after the eruption. Turned it into a wasteland. One volcano. During Noah's flood, the fountains of the great deep broke loose. There were, because of the amount of lava we see that formed and the stuff that flowed out underneath the water, we know it's pillowed lava that happened during the flood. There were thousands of volcanoes going off during Noah's flood. God was demonstrating how much He hates sin. once and for all, locked in the rock record for all to see, in an undeniable way. There's how much of the mountain is missing because most of it flowed down into the valley. Now, the second topic. As this flood flow flowed down into the valley, all of that sediment you saw in those previous pictures sloshed down into Spirit Lake. The water was at almost supersonic speeds, I believe, shot out of that lake up onto the top of these surrounding cliffs and ripped every single tree, all of the sediment, all the dirt, all the soil, and scored several feet deep into solid granite erosion grooves into the surrounding cliff lines and washed the trees back down into the lake, which is now higher. The bottom of the lake is now higher than the top used to be because all that sediment flowed down into that lake. Now, that sediment was hot. It was mixed with steam and it was mixed with gas, and it was compacted as it slammed down into that valley. And that compacted steam would sit there for a while, and through the various pores, the steam would gather into pockets, and every once in a while those pockets would explode up out of the sediment in what was called a steam explosion pit. You see, this area used to be a ash flow, sediment flow area where the mountain flowed down, and it was just level straight across here. Well, the steam collected, burst up out of there in one of these steam explosions, and left this drainage pattern. Now, for 100 years or more, as geologists go through school, they are trained, when you see this sort of pattern in any sort of rocks or cliffs, it means that enormous periods of time have passed, thousands of years have passed, as water has slowly drained off of the land and created the dendritic drainage pattern. That's the way they're trained to think. Here it was created in an instant, as the steam just exploded up out of the ground. Same data, same pattern, different explanation, modern model of how it could happen. Here's a helicopter flying over. You see a steam explosion pit, a steam explosion pit, a steam explosion pit, a steam explosion pit. Well, over the subsequent weeks and months, as it rained and rained and rained, these pits would fill up full of this unconsolidated sediment around it. Eventually, the water broke from one to the next to the next. This happened about 6 months after Mount St. Helens, and it formed an entirely new river valley. When this flood happened, it's documented, it lasted for several hours, flowed through there and carved a river valley 600 feet deep through, in some cases, solid rock, not just unconsolidated sediment. Because moving water full of particles has enormous power to erode very rapidly. Well, this was perfect because for the first time, geologists were able to look at what does sediment that flows at high energies look like when it's laid down. I would think, as all that sediment was flowing down the mountain, it would be like a big blender that just blended it all up, and you just have a homogenized bunch of mashed potato mess at the bottom of the mountain. But that's not what they found. As the river cut through that sediment, what they found were layers. That 90-mile-an-hour flow of sediment down the mountain layered it all out into fine horizontal layers of sediment. Here's a look at it. You see, this was all the stuff that flowed down the mountain. It flowed down in layers. If you look closer, you see millimeter-thin little lines right down to the little teeniest millimeter, and then another millimeter and another millimeter laid out by this energetic flood flow event. Now, what are geologists taught? You go out to the rocks, you count the layers, you say, well, each one might represent a season where you had a dry season, a wet season, and different amounts of dust settle down. It might take a year or 10 years to form a layer. You have many thousands of layers, you have hundreds of thousands of years have passed. It happened like that because of a flood flow event down the mountain. Same data, same rocks, different interpretation. Here's the river valley that was formed by that subsequent event. You have a little tiny stream at the bottom of a great big river canyon. Millions of years, remember what Darwin saw? Big river valley, little river. Millions of years must have passed, affected his entire thinking about reality. Formed in a matter of hours, not over huge periods of time. Where else have we seen that huge canyon? Little river, bottom of a great big canyon, horizontal sediment layers, the Grand Canyon. And we now know the red wall limestone, the most distinctive layer there, had to have been formed in a flood flow event. It all fits. It fits the biblical model of truth. You see, that event, that river valley, showed us that canyons can form rapidly, that flood flows produce these horizontal layers, and that large geological features form rapidly. Okay, the last two topics. 150 miles of square miles, 150 square miles of trees were blown down. Snap. Every leaf ripped off of them almost instantly, snapped down like toothpicks laying on the ground. This is a color picture. Just covered with ash. No color left. Total devastation. Get that picture in your mind. That's how much God hates sin. Not people, but the sin that's within us. And He does bring judgment. Total devastation. That's what the world looked like after Noah's flood. That's why Noah, after the boat landed, couldn't let the animals off for months. He had to sit on that ark with those stinking animals for 2 months. I mean, he had to be getting frustrated. But if he'd let them off right away, they'd have all died. But think how fast weeds grow and things reroot themselves. Within weeks and months, things would have started to regreen. And they have at Mount St. Helens too. But he couldn't just let them off right away. See, the whole account, it's not a story, the account of Noah's Ark only makes sense if you read it to mean what it says. A worldwide flood, a boat big enough to hold 2 of every species of mammal, bird, amphibian on the planet alive and extinct. Why would it have been that big if it was for a local flood? Anyway, back to Mount St. Helens. That was all extra. Trucks thrown around like Tonka trucks, just like toys. Trees knocked down by the millions. And a whole bunch of those trees ended up floating on Spirit Lake. This is all tree. This is just a mass of trees. Over 1 million trees, some of them 3 foot in diameter, floating back and forth as the wind blows and abrades against them. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, this is the one that gets me probably more than anything else I've talked about. Steve Austin was getting his PhD in geology. He's a creationist. He believed in a young earth. He was a Christian who believed the Bible meant what it said. Hid it so that he could get his PhD in geology. He was at the University of Pennsylvania. Lots of coal in Pennsylvania. Decided to specialize in coal. He studied coal and discovered that coal is almost always layered. My father heated his house with coal, and I can actually remember coal coming. It would just come in sheets, and it would break apart in sheets. It's just like layered deposit. Now, we're told it formed in a peat swamp over millions of years. That was a picture we'll see in textbooks of an old swamp where trees drop down and they slowly turn into peat that over millions of years gets covered and turned into coal. Well, Pete had studied peat. Steve Austin had studied peat swamps, and he noted that the roots that come down through the layers of peat tend to push and pull and twist and distort, and it just mixed it all up, and it wasn't at all layered in appearance. You can see the underlying rock has layers, but the peat itself has no layered appearance, and yet coal is layered. So it just didn't fit. So he developed an entirely new model of how coal could form. He theorized there at the University of Pittsburgh that coal forms because there was a huge floating mat of vegetation that would sit in a certain area, and that decaying matter or abraded matter or dead matter would drop off of this floating mat and form a layer of peat under the ocean. Now, we can form coal in any laboratory by merely taking a tree or bark or straw or any kind of organic cellulosic matter and squeezing it under high pressure and high temperature in the absence of oxygen. And in a matter of hours, we can form coal. We know very well how coal forms. And this explains how coal could have formed in a way other than in a local swamp and would have a layered appearance. Now, to get a PhD, you have to defend your thesis in front of the experts, the PhD experts. And he went in and did that and explained his model and explained his research and explained his observations. And the professors in charge, the geologists at University of Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania, they said, your model fits the evidence extremely well, but it couldn't possibly be the way coal actually formed, because if that's the way coal formed, it is so widespread, you'd have to have a floating vegetation mat that would cover the entire Earth. So therefore, it can't possibly be true. And second, there's no existing model of a floating vegetation mat currently in the world today. But he got his PhD anyway because it was good work, and they couldn't deny that it was good work and a good theory. It just didn't fit their preconceptions. That was 1979. In 1980, Mount St. Helens explodes, and there's a floating vegetation mat of 1 million trees at Mount St. Helens on Spirit Lake. So while the mountain's still smoking, Steve Austin decided to go scuba diving and see what he could find underneath these floating trees. He's looking up at the trees. What he found were 10, 20, 30 feet deep layer of abraded bark and waterlogged trees and organic matter laying on the bottom of the lake, exactly what he expected. And all it would take to turn that into a coal seam would be another geological event, a rapid burial by another flow of sediment that compressed it rapidly, which would cause a lot of heat generation in the lack of oxygen. And you turn it into coal, just what his model predicted. Last subject. The other thing Steve noted was that a lot of these trees were bobbing straight up and down. There's a tree bobbing straight up and down in the lake. There's a whole series of trees like a buoy just bobbing because they get waterlogged. One end gets waterlogged. There's rocks in the root bundle. Root bundle's still attached because it just got ripped out, roots and all. By the way, look at the surrounding cliffs. Those were a gorgeous, lush forest of 3-foot thick trees. Now they're just barren rocks scraped down through the granite, eroded. They did a sonar tracking, tracked 10,000 trees standing upright on the lake bottom. So this is what's happening. You get a lot of trees floating prone, horizontal. You get some trees waterlogged, floating upright. Eventually they might get so waterlogged they drop to the bottom. More and more sediment drops and buries them, and then another one's at a different level. More sediment drops, and you get another one buried at a different level. So you get these upright trees buried amongst a bunch of organic peat matter at the bottom of the lake. Now, for about 100 years at Yellowstone National Park, there's an area called Specimen Ridge. And this was in the textbooks of the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s up into the 80s. It would point out Specimen Ridge as one of the premier proofs that the Earth has to be hundreds of thousands of years old or more. Because on this ridge in Yellowstone National Park, there's a whole series of forests. You see at the bottom layer, there were a bunch of broken off trees that were just in an upright position. And then there's another layer of trees, and another layer of trees, and another layer of trees. And in the textbooks and in the park sign itself, it said, this represents 32 separate forests that grew in this area. And as a volcanic event happened and the trees got snapped off and petrified and buried in ash and other sediments that would petrify them, another forest would eventually, after hundreds of years, regrow. And then there would be another geological event, and there might be 1,000 years that would pass, and it would get wiped out and regrow. And it happened 32 times, and it represents hundreds of thousands of years of Earth history. Until Mount St. Helens, there was no better explanation. But you see what you've got here is an enormous flood that would have covered this entire valley down hundreds of feet deep, and the sediment just slowly dropped. And the trees dropped, and more sediment was washed in, and then more trees dropped, and more sediment washed in. And you just got a deposit just like's happening at Mount St. Helens, except rapidly. But it would take a flood of worldwide proportions to explain that mountain ridge. And furthermore, they've since discovered that the root bundles none of them continue on out into the roots. They all seem to be broken off, and the trees that are laying in a prone position are statistically oriented in every single forest in the same flow direction. How does that happen for 32 different forests over hundreds of thousands of years? See, it's a flood flow deposit. There's so much evidence that supports the biblical worldview. Here's a picture of those broken off root bundles. Okay, the summary. Layered deposit can form so rapidly if given a large energetic flood. A flood of worldwide proportions would have wiped out the life on this planet and would have buried billions of living organisms in coal seams and fossil seams all over this planet. Clams at the top of the highest mountains. It's exactly what we find. Huge river canyons can be explained by lakes of enormous proportions covering like the central United States, the western United States, breaking through to form things like the Grand Canyon. And that's a model that fits the Grand Canyon very well. Coal formation is really best explained by a flood of worldwide proportions. And Specimen Ridge used to ridicule the Bible is now best explained by a flood of worldwide proportions. This is where I like to summarize, by not emphasizing, and I'm not just talking about our home schools and our Christian schools, we have got to reach the world around us with this message, because it's not going to be taught in the schools. We're the ones that are going to do it. And by not emphasizing the creation and the fall and the flood as real historical events, the Bible and ultimately the church loses its credibility to the world. If you can't believe it when it says, in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh, now you go and do likewise, that's one of the 10 commandments, why should you obey the commandment? And if that commandment doesn't mean what it says, why should you obey the other commandments? You see the problem? You throw out what the Bible says about the physical world, and the world's going to throw out what the Bible has to say about the spiritual world. And that's exactly where we're at today. And it's not a meaningless theological subject. It deals with what people believe to be reality. Stated another way, if we send our children and we are our neighbor's keeper, allow our neighbor's children to be sent through an educational, media, and museum and entertainment system, which basically says you can't trust anything the Bible has to say about biology, anything it has to say about geology, anything it says to say about psychology and the sinful nature of man, and cosmology, where the cosmos came from, or the physical world, why would we be surprised when they then walk away from their Christian faith and define their own relative morality? You see what's going on. You see how important this is. Last slide. 2,000 years ago, this was all predicted. I think this is speaking to the church people. God, through the Holy Spirit, wrote down these words. He said, scoffers will come in the last days saying, all things have continued as they were from the beginning of creation. That's the definition of uniformitarianism. All things are pretty much present processes that you can extrapolate back indefinitely. But by the Word of God, the earth was made out of water, and the world that then existed perished, being flooded by water. There will be a denial in the period of time where God's getting ready to wrap things up, where there'll be a denial of creation and a denial of a worldwide flood. And if we're ever living in that day and age, it's right now, here today. And the challenge is, are you going to be a scoffer? Or are you going, what God's very definition of a scoffer is those who deny creation and a flood. Our churches are full of them. And we can lead people to Christ and why He came by helping them to understand you can trust what the Bible has to say about the physical world around us. Now, what I've been trying to do for years is produce resources that make it really easy to reach out to those around us, because they're not large technical books. Devotionals that every day talk about these same kind of things on Mount St. Helens and floods and fossils and starlight, how it could have gotten here in a short period of time. Newspaper articles that can go into newsletters and have all the latest information that's come out of the Institute for Creation Research about where things came from. 15-minute radio talks that go through the biography of great Christian scientists and talk about different things from nature and talk about dinosaurs and talk about the Ice Age. And in the same way I've talked tonight, in very understandable ways that can be given to people that they can listen to as they drive along. And all of the lectures I've done are in a 4 CD pack where they're a 1-hour lecture that include all the PowerPoint slides that can be listened to. And they're priced in a way to give to others. So that's what this table is all about. And I think it gives people a tool, because you hear a talk like this and you get all fired up and then you think, yeah, but I'm not a scientist, what can I do? Well, you can share the truth, and there's ways to do it, and it does impact people's lives. So that's where I'm going to wrap up, and then we'll do questions for however long. So, thanks. Treat this organization like a missionary outfit. They are a missionary organization to our culture, and no one else is doing this work. So I would strongly just support them like you would support a missionary. Thank you. Any questions? I think you were first back here.
After Mount St. Helens went up, you could see the evidence supporting the flood that scientists did come to Christ and see the Bible.
Yep. The question was, after Mount St. Helens specifically, when you see this sort of absolutely graphic evidence of layers that form rapidly and the other kind of things I talked about, was there a large influx or a significant acknowledgement of the biblical creation worldview amongst scientists and geologists? The answer is no. Look at what we just heard about the dinosaur bone. You know, soft tissue in a dinosaur bone, and they found much more since then. And all the subsequent studies have shown it really is dinosaur tissue, and yet they still aren't willing to acknowledge that it isn't 65, 70 million years old. It's the bias thing. And it really is understandable. If you take a young child, and from the time he grows up, he never hears or sees anything on any of his TV shows or movies or the X-Men and the Spider-Man. They all mention evolution, all these popular movies. And in the schools and in the museums, and he gets up into college, and he's got his PhD, and he's surrounded by other people who believe firmly that evolution's the truth. And then you happen to see, well, layers can form rapidly. That the evidence is not going to convince him. But if the Lord can, ultimately this is a spiritual battle. Ultimately, the Holy Spirit will open people's eyes and does open people's eyes. And for many people, this is a key for them. And there have been many scientists, not the majority, not like a switch from a few percent to 20% now believe in creation. But this kind of thing does open some people's eyes. But the evidence in and of itself probably won't do it. It's just going to be a key amongst other things. Someone else over here, I think, had their hand up first, and then I'll come back to you. Go ahead.
My question is almost the same. Basically, I guess I just wonder what in the world, how do you explain Mount St. Helens in the universities when they're training PhD evolutions? Just last week, I questioned University of Minnesota professor who is a professor of evolutionary biology, and I asked him, don't you think that Mount St. Helens makes a difference and changes your view on some of this? And he looked at me like he didn't understand at all what I was talking about. And he said, Mount St. Helens is nothing but ash.
Okay, and to be fair, let me repeat it. You specifically, and I'm going to summarize, you have an example where you were talking to a biologist from a major university and trying to explain how the things that happened at Mount St. Helens really undermined his view of biological evolution and how it could explain how rock layers and fossils could have formed rapidly. His response was, well, it's just a bunch of ash. To be fair, that's probably all he's heard. He has never sat down and listened to a lecture like this. He's never seen it in his textbooks. He's probably maybe seen a picture of layer deposits, but they will, in order to fit them into their paradigm of reality, just say, well, that's been multiple flood events with lots of time in between. So you can fit anything into a theory as loose as evolution. Let me give you an example. In the early 50s, it was taught the Cambrian layer of life, which involves an explosion of all the different fossils. You know, in the Cambrian layer, below it, you find no undisputed evidences of life. There's some disputed single cells things that probably settled down in those layers early on. But in the Cambrian layer, you find all of the different forms of life. You find shellfish, and you find coral, and you find insect-like types life, and things with external shells. You find things with backbones. All the basic phyla of life are suddenly there. It's like you have a single-celled organism, and you have a jellyfish, and nothing in between. What better evidence for creation could you ever have than that? How do you go from a single-celled organism to a starfish and leave nothing in between? You just suddenly have a starfish. That's creation. So he already knows that evidence, and he's already in his own mind just kind of said, well, they just never fossilized somehow. Well, in the 60s, it was said there's no fish in the Cambrian layer, the early, and then they started to find fish in the Cambrian layer. Well, evolution just expanded to say it happened really fast. And in the 70s, they started to find fish with backbones in the Cambrian layer. Backbones weren't supposed to have formed for 100 million years later. Well, they just expanded the theory of evolution to say it happened even faster. You see, it's a framework of philosophy that won't be given up because it's just a belief system. So the evidence isn't going to change the man's mind. Maybe. I personally believe that's the method God uses with many people, because we are told to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, all of our soul, and all of our strength, and all of our mind. And the church, I'm afraid, is going to be very, very sorry when the church in general, as they stand before the Lord someday, and realize they've just totally ignored the physical world part of what God's Word has to say. And that's the mind part. So continue to use the evidence. I know I didn't really answer your question, how do you reach Him? But there are definitely examples where giving the books and giving the information and doing it in a loving way and not trying to say, you're wrong, I'm forcing my opinion on you, eventually opens people up to the truth. But then they're in a quandary because they're stuck in an education system that won't allow them to teach the truth. So.
Yeah, the sad thing about Mary Schweitzer is she's an evangelical Christian.
Oh, you can tell. She was uncomfortable with some of those conclusions.
It's a hostile environment.
Yeah.
A lot of Christians have taken on protective coloration in order to further their career.
I think she probably got reamed for some of the things she said in that interview by her colleagues. And by the way, I will share the whole 5-minute interview with somebody, and you guys will have it that you can share with others at some point. It's just fascinating, the entire interview.
One other quick question. Tell about the re-emergence of plant life on Mount St. Helens.
Yeah, Mount St. Helens, when it happened, the ecological community, they thought it was going to be a devastation for decades, if not centuries. They thought it would be just a wiping out of life for huge periods of time. Within years, it had reforested itself in pine trees. Within a decade, the elk and the wildlife had moved back in, and amazingly, the deer and the elk started to have twins and triplets in enormous amounts of numbers in those areas where they normally don't. And it's like God has programmed these things into biological life to fill environmental niches, and it kicks in somehow and in some unknown ways. Right now, it's once again, it's been coming up on 25 to 30, 26 years since it happened. It's a very well-forested national park area again. So this earth is incredibly resilient, and God built it that way to reproduce after huge disasters, and that's what would have been happening after Noah's flood. So, go ahead.
Dave Nutting, Alpha Omega Institute, Director of Alpha Omega. To answer your question up there, that's how he came to the Lord. That's how he ended up forming Alpha Omega.
That's a great point.
Is by reading, actually it was a rather small book that he just, it blew him away. He'd never heard of such a thing. He's never taught this. He had no idea.
Yeah.
He has no idea. But that's how it happens.
Yeah, so
just one of these books, one of these things.
Yep, and I'm going to just repeat that comment. And there are many, many more examples. Dave Nutting, who runs a wonderful ministry called Alpha Omega out in Colorado, has camps for young people. I highly recommend it. Our family went to it. We have a whole week of teaching and then fun activities in the afternoon. He was an evolutionist, taught evolution. Gary Parker, who's written wonderful books, same thing. Dwayne Gish, same thing. Myself, same thing. The evidence, seeing it for the first time, especially the evidence for a flood, is what woke me up. And I realized I'd been lied to all these years. It does make a difference. Yeah.
My mother grew up near there. She was born in 1896, and she grew up with a Native American girl. And in about 1936, we went to visit that family. And I listened to these two women visit. My mother mentioned Spirit Lake, and Bella said, we never go up there, the Native Americans. We never go up there because very strange things have happened.
Interesting.
Wasn't there some sort of, at least journalistic evidence that something happened in around 1850?
Yes. Now, I'm not an absolute expert in there, but I do remember reading. And I'll just repeat the comment. Now, you said it was your mother?
Yeah.
His mother, back in the early 1900s, had a close tie with the American Indians. They considered the whole Spirit Lake region taboo, basically.
Exactly.
They didn't want to go there. And there has been historical accounts. Remember, we've only been up in the Pacific Northwest for about 300 years. Before that, it was pretty much totally unexplored, unknown, very little known or written about it. But there was the feeling by the Native Americans, you got to stay away from that area. And there's also, there's quite likely volcanic gas releases or previous volcanism would have happened. Had that happened before modern man arrived, and they look at these geological layers, and by the way, that sediment that flowed down into that valley where the river broke through, exposed the sediment, within 10 years you could take a ball peen hammer and you could pound on that cliff and it's solid rock. As solid as any other rock you would find. The geologists would have looked at things that would have happened in the 15, 16, even 1700s. 100 years later, total reforestation, and assume it must have happened hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years ago.
I was there within a few days after the
Okay.
first one and saw 5 more eruptions. And the ash along the road would look like the snow here in Minnesota.
Yeah.
That ash wasn't ash like your fireplace. That ash was actually, we had to change our air cleaners every few hours as it was driving.
So it's like talcum powder.
Actually glass.
Okay.
It was glass.
Okay.
It was microscopic glass.
Gotcha.
That's why it was able to erode the rock so rapidly, is because these pieces of glass, small that they were cutting away. I mean, it cut away everything.
Yeah. And I'll just repeat that and then go to another question. The ash itself, which was mixed with the sediment and the dirt and the rocks, was like fine little sharp shards of glass on a microscopic level. And you just think of sandblasting. It's just like blasting away. A sandblast, you can blast through metal. Just at high velocities, just burned its way through the other existing rock sediment. Back here we had a question.
Yeah, I had a question. This event happened 27 years ago. Have they found the bodies of people that were killed in the event? What condition they were in there?
Not to my knowledge. The question was that there were at least 8 people died during the initial eruption. There were probably some others. They're not, considering what happened, and amazingly few people lost their lives in this large-scale event. There was one man named Harry Truman who refused to leave. I heard at least one man say, and I don't know if it's true, that nobody died during this event who didn't refuse to leave or wasn't there illegally, wouldn't have died had they just done what they told. But he was buried, just totally buried in ash. They've never found any of those bodies. They're not looking for them. I suspect they would look like the people of Pompeii. They find people in Pompeii where they actually have the casts of their bodies. It's like a shell, and they see exactly what they were doing and what they looked like and their physical shape and everything. Okay. Over here?
Do the scientists she asked if the scientists already thought it was just ash. Well, do they purposely not read about evidence that proves them wrong, so that when they get proved wrong, they can truthfully say why?
No, it's not purposeful. The question was, when they just find all this ash, and they assume it's was a huge period of time or not a massive geological volcano event, do they purposefully deny the evidence? I don't think it's purposeful. It's just they're blinded by their preconceptions. And remember, Mount St. Helens, a largest part of that sediment layer that was carved out by that river was not ash. It was the rocks and the stones and the sand and the bark and the trees and the organic matter that was instantly just vaporized and pulverized and flowed down the mountain. And then an ash layer would settle on top of that. And then there was some subsequent flood flows and then more ash layers. You see, that doesn't prove creation. It doesn't prove a worldwide flood. It merely shows us the kind of things that could have been happening on a much wider scale during that flood. So a geologist who's stuck with his belief in evolution will just say, well, yeah, that shows the kind of things that could happen during a little local flood. But then he just is blinded to the idea that you can then transfer that to the huge sediment layers across an entire continent that would have taken a worldwide flood to have formed.
So I think the questions will go up until 9 o'clock.
Okay, probably one or two more.
I'm sure there'll be informal questions. But
Sure.
Just one other thing that Dr. Samat told us last month is that a practicing scientist is so focused on his very tiny microscopic area of science, reading everything on that, he just gets the broad sweep. Reads the news releases, and he doesn't.
Yeah, I honestly think it's like the biologists and the biochemists who understand chemicals could never come together to form life. They think the evidence for evolution is over here in the fossils. I honestly think the people in the fossils who look at the Cambrian layer and realize there's all these missing links, they think the evidence is with the paleontologists. The paleontologists think the evidence is with the cosmologists, and they're just blinded. You can't expect a blind man to see unless you teach them what the truth is, and that's the Christian's job. We're to be the light that teaches the truth.
In Dr. Dobson's Truth Project, he had Carl Sagan's clip from his Cosmos, which most of the public schools, I think, have seen in this country. And he used the same types of terms that Charles Lyell used. He used psychology. And if he had come out and said, God, there is no God, it wouldn't have flown. But he couched his terms in psychological terms, and therefore he fooled a lot of people.
Yeah, and I'll comment just a second on that. Cosmos, it was a PBS public paid for, I believe, 8-hour series, and an enormously popular book in the 1980s. That's the framework of reference for the teachers of today. That was 20 years ago. Carl Sagan said the cosmos is all there is, all there ever was, or all there ever will be. Now here's the representative scientist of the United States, of the scientific establishment. The cosmos is all there is, all there ever was, or all there ever will be. Now how scientifically could you ever prove that? See, that's a non-scientific statement. That's a statement of philosophy. And yet he very smoothly, with a deep melodic voice and lots of graphics and lots of just very comforting explanation, tried to say, we're not fighting against religion. We're not fighting against Christianity. We're just trying to show you how reality works. And we'll clearly separate speculation from scientific truth. And then he would go on to speculate endlessly. But people would just eat this up. And one of the videos over there, I show some clips from Carl Sagan's Cosmos and try to point out how that's so misleading. It's the same thing Charles Lyell did. It's not a direct attack on the church. It's undermining people's trust in God's Word. And isn't that what Satan did at the very beginning? When he said to Eve, did God really say you can't eat from the truth of life? You'll surely not die. See, it wasn't an attack on God's character. It was an attack on his credibility. That's what's going on.
You mentioned that geological column a number of times. You referred to it. Isn't it true that Charles Lyell was the man that actually invented the geological column?
It is.
It doesn't exist.
It is. The Charles Lyell, Principles of Geology, he said there's these geologic epochs where certain things happen. You can find certain animals in certain layers, and then one layer builds up on top of another, and that's what I showed you with the coral leading to the shellfish, leading to the fish, leading to the amphibians, and so on. And that's what led to Charles Darwin's tree of life. Started with geology, but it exists. It's debated that maybe there's some areas of the earth where you can get most of those layers, but it's just an invention in the mind of man. It's not the true history of what happened. It's what's found in those layers of rock. And there's often rock in the wrong spot. It's not even in the right spot. Whenever that happens, a geologist said there was an overthrust where the lower layers of rock was thrust up on top of the higher layers of rock, whether there's evidence for it or not. Because to not do that is to throw out the entire scheme and to say that only leaves the instantaneous creation of life. And science has been defined to not allow that. And that's what's going on. If you realize what's going on, you can help lead people to the truth. So we'll wrap up. Well, the gap theory just suddenly appeared in the 1800s when we had science accepting these millions and billions of years and theologians saying, oh, we got to go find all that time in the Bible. So they suddenly found billions of years between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, where for 2,000 years it was never seen in the Bible. And if there was all that time, and all those layers were laid down during those millions of years of the gap, or during the flood of Lucifer, then what did Noah's flood do? It must not have disturbed that sediment at all, which makes no sense. So you're denying what the Bible does say in order to speculate on what the Bible doesn't say. It destroys the credibility of the Bible. That's the problem.
Well, thank you. And
Yep.
be sure to get the literature pickup posters for next month. Ian Taylor, one of his books is called In the Minds of Men.
Yep.
But come back next month and find out how smart Adam and Eve were. Let's give him a
Okay, thanks.